There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary, moments that retrospectively become the anchor point for everything that follows. They are rarely loud. They don't announce themselves with thunder or fanfare. They come in whispers, in the quiet spaces between heartbeats, in the subtle shift of weight on a mattress in the middle of the night. For me, that moment had a sound. The soft click of my bedroom door easing open, a sound I had learned to anticipate with a strange and painful mixture of hope and dread. It was the sound of a boundary dissolving, of a question being asked without a single word. And then came the whisper, a fragile thread of sound in the profound stillness of our apartment. Leo. Julian's voice was a rough, sleepy thing, scraped raw by exhaustion and something else I couldn't yet name. I didn't answer. I lay perfectly still, my breathing measured, feigning the deep, untroubled sleep of a man who was not acutely aware of every single molecule of air being displaced in the room. The floorboards, old and talkative, gave a gentle groan under his weight as he crossed the small space from the door to my bed. I felt the dip in the mattress before I felt the warmth of his body, a cautious settling at the far edge, as if he were perched on the precipice of a cliff. He was giving me an out. He was always giving me an out, a space for plausible deniability that we both clung to like a life raft. If I rolled over and feigned surprise, if I grumbled a sleepy question, the spell would be broken. He would retreat, mumbling an apology about a nightmare or the cold, and the carefully constructed wall of our friendship would be mortared back into place. But I didn't move. I lay there, my back to him, and listened to the sound of his breathing, trying to sync it with my own frantic pulse. The silence stretched, filled with the weight of everything we had never said to one another in the 6 years we had known each other. It was a silence dense with the history of late-night conversations, shared pizzas, movie marathons, and the easy, uncomplicated affection that had defined our friendship. But now, that silence was different. It was charged, humming with a new and terrifying current. Finally, after an eternity that was probably no more than 30 seconds, he spoke again, his voice closer now, a mere breath against the back of my neck. "Don't tell anyone," he said. It wasn't a request. It was a plea, a confession, and a condition all wrapped into one. It was the password to a secret room I hadn't even been sure existed. And with those words, he shifted, a slow, deliberate movement across the final few inches of mattress that separated us. An arm, heavy with sleep and a weariness that seemed to go down to the bone, draped over my waist. His chest pressed against my back, a solid line of heat. He tucked his face into the space between my shoulder blades, and a long, shuddering sigh escaped him, a sound of such profound relief that it seemed to vibrate through my entire skeleton. It was the sound of a man who had been lost at sea and had finally, blessedly, found shore. And I, the shore, could do nothing but lie there, rigid and silent, trying to remember how to breathe. This was the moment. The ordinary, extraordinary moment that changed everything. And in the darkness, with the weight of him holding me in place, I began to catalog the past, searching for the precise sequence of events that had led us here, to this precipice, to this beautiful, terrifying, unspoken thing. We had met in the most unromantic way imaginable, through a university housing questionnaire that algorithmically determined we were a 92% compatibility match. I was a quiet, introspective art student who saw the world in terms of light and composition. He was a gregarious, brilliant engineering major who saw the world in terms of systems and efficiency. On paper, it was an absurd pairing. Julian arrived on move-in day like a contained weather system, a whirlwind of easy smiles, loud music, and an infectious energy that seemed to physically alter the drab, cinder-block dimensions of our shared dorm room. He unpacked in a flurry of organized chaos, while I meticulously arranged my few belongings, my cameras, my books, my sketchpads, as if building a small, quiet fortress against his cheerful invasion. I was convinced it would be a disaster. I had braced myself for a year of awkward silences and negotiated territories, of headphones and passive-aggressive notes about dirty dishes. But Julian was not a man you could build a fortress against. He was more like the tide, a persistent, gentle force that simply wore away at your defenses until you found yourself part of his landscape. He didn't mock my quietness. He seemed to respect it, filling the silence with his own stories and observations without demanding I reciprocate in kind. He'd come back from a late-night study session, find me hunched over a charcoal drawing, and wouldn't ask what it was. Instead, he'd just say, "The shadows on that look really cool," before grabbing a bottle of water from the mini fridge. He learned, with an almost unnerving perceptiveness, how to exist around me without disrupting my orbit. He learned that I needed hours of silence to work, that I hated talking on the phone, and that I organized my books by color, a fact he found endlessly amusing but never judged. In return, I found myself drawn into his world. He had a way of making the complex seem simple, of breaking down the world into understandable parts. He'd explain the physics of a suspension bridge with the same passion I reserved for the chiaroscuro in a Caravaggio painting. He taught me how to cook something other than instant noodles, patiently walking me through the sacred geometry of dicing an onion. He dragged me to parties I had no interest in attending, but would then spend the entire night near me, acting as a social buffer, introducing me to people with a casual, "This is Leo. He's the quiet genius I live with." An introduction that always made me flush with a mixture of embarrassment and a strange, unbidden warmth. We were an oddity, the sun-drenched engineer and the shadow-dwelling photographer, but somehow, it worked. We fell into a rhythm that was as comfortable and unconscious as breathing. Our room became a sanctuary, a shared space that was more than just a place to sleep. It was where he would pace, untangling a complex coding problem out loud, and where I would sit, listening to the cadence of his voice as I edited photos, the technical jargon a kind of soothing background music. The affection I developed for him was a slow-developing photograph. In the beginning, it was just a latent image, an indistinct feeling of comfort and admiration. I admired his easy confidence, the way he moved through the world as if he inherently belonged in it. I was grateful for his kindness, for the way he saw the person I was behind my wall of silence. But slowly, over time, the details began to emerge. I started noticing things. The way a small dimple appeared next to his mouth when he was trying not to laugh. The exact shade of green in his eyes when the afternoon light hit them just right. The way he would run a hand through his already messy hair when he was stressed. A gesture so uniquely him that the sight of it could make my chest ache. The image sharpened into focus one rainy Tuesday in our sophomore year. He'd been sick with a miserable flu for days, and I'd been playing reluctant nurse, fetching him water and soup and enduring his fever-fueled, rambling monologues. That evening, he was finally quiet, sleeping fitfully on his bed. I was at my desk, trying to finish an assignment, but the sound of his ragged breathing was a constant distraction. I looked over at him, and in the dim glow of my desk lamp, he looked younger, more vulnerable than I had ever seen him. His usual vibrant energy was gone, replaced by a pale, fragile stillness. His hair was plastered to his forehead with sweat, and his brow was furrowed in a troubled dream. Without thinking, I got up, took a cloth, and wet it with cool water from the sink. I sat on the edge of his bed, the mattress creaking under my weight, and gently wiped his forehead. His skin was hot to the touch. He stirred, his eyes fluttering open, unfocused and hazy. He mumbled my name, a questioning sound. "It's okay," I whispered, my voice softer than I intended. "Just a fever. Go back to sleep." He didn't seem to fully register my words, but he leaned into my touch, a small, unconscious movement of trust. And in that moment, as I held the cool cloth to his skin, the photograph in my mind fully developed. The indistinct fondness snapped into a clear, sharp, undeniable image. I loved him. It was a terrifying realization, a piece of knowledge that felt like contraband. I tucked it away immediately, burying it deep in a part of myself that I never showed to anyone. Our friendship was too important, too precious to risk on the volatile chemistry of a feeling he would almost certainly not return. Julian was a creature of sunlight and easy affection for the world, especially the female part of it. He had a string of friendly, casual girlfriends, all of whom were smart and beautiful and seemed to fit so effortlessly into his life. I learned to be the supportive friend, the good roommate. I listened to him talk about his dates, offered non-committal advice, and perfected a mask of placid neutrality that hid the quiet, frantic churning inside me. I told myself it was enough. Being his friend, his anchor, his constant, that had to be enough. And for years it was. We moved out of the dorms and into a small, slightly run-down two-bedroom apartment. We graduated. I started taking on freelance photography gigs, slowly building a portfolio. He was recruited by a prestigious consulting firm, a job that promised a brilliant career and a punishing travel schedule. Our lives were diverging, yet our apartment remained the central point, the place we both returned to. It was home. The shift began subtly. It wasn't a sudden earthquake, but a slow, tectonic creep, a gradual change in the landscape of our friendship that I felt long before I could see it. The catalyst was his job. In the beginning, he loved it. The travel, the challenge, the feeling of solving impossible problems for massive corporations. He would come home buzzing with energy, full of stories about airport lounges and boardroom battles. He was thriving, and I was happy for him, even as a small, selfish part of me missed the version of him who was just there. The roommate who would be lounging on the couch when I got home, who would help me carry groceries up the 3 flights of stairs, whose presence was a simple, reliable fact of my daily life. But after the first year, the buzz started to fade. The stories he told were less about the thrill of the work and more about the crushing exhaustion. He spoke of the profound loneliness of hotel rooms that all looked the same, of sterile conference centers and meals eaten alone from room service trays. The vibrant energy that had always defined him began to fray at the edges. He came home less like a conquering hero and more like a refugee seeking sanctuary. He would drop his bags by the door, shed his perfectly tailored suit like a skin he couldn't wait to be free of, and collapse onto the couch with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 miles. It was during this period that he and Sarah, his girlfriend of 2 years, broke up. It was a quiet, amicable split, the kind that happens when 2 people realize their lives are simply moving in opposite directions. He didn't seem devastated, just hollowed out. He spoke about it with a clinical detachment that was more worrying than any display of grief would have been. It just wasn't working, he'd said, staring at the television without really seeing it. We wanted different things. She wants someone who's there. And I'm not. That night, he didn't go to his own room. He fell asleep on the couch, curled into a tight ball, looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. I found a blanket and draped it over him, my movements slow and careful, as if he were made of glass. I stood there for a long time in the semi-darkness, watching the rhythmic rise and fall of his shoulders, and I felt that old, familiar ache in my chest, the one I had worked so hard to suppress. It was the ache of wanting to offer a comfort that went beyond a warm blanket. That night on the couch was the beginning of the ritual, though neither of us would have called it that. It became his habit. He would come home from a trip, drained and silent, and our evenings would follow a new, unwritten script. We'd order takeout, put on a movie we'd both seen a dozen times, and somewhere around the halfway point, his head would find its way to my shoulder. The first time it happened, my entire body went rigid. I was a statue, terrified that a single breath would shatter the moment. He was asleep, or pretending to be, his breathing deep and even against my neck. I could feel the warmth of him through my t-shirt, smell the faint, clean scent of his shampoo mixed with the stale air of an airplane. My mind was a deafening chorus of warnings and longings. This is just friendship, a voice of reason insisted. He's exhausted. He's lonely. It doesn't mean anything. But another, more treacherous voice whispered, "But what if it does?" I sat there for hours, long after the movie had ended and the screen had gone black, my arm numb, my muscles screaming in protest. I didn't want to move. I wanted to live in that moment, in the fragile, ambiguous space where the weight of his head on my shoulder could be interpreted as anything I wanted it to be. Eventually, he stirred, blinking in the darkness, a soft, confused sound escaping his lips. He pulled away, rubbing his eyes. "Sorry," he mumbled, his voice thick with sleep. "Must have passed out." He didn't meet my eyes. He just stood up, stretched, and shuffled off to his own room, leaving me alone on the couch with the phantom warmth of his body and the roaring silence in my head. It kept happening. It became our thing. Movie night, which had once been about the movie, was now just a pretext for this strange, new form of intimacy. He would settle onto the couch, always leaving a respectable distance between us, but as the evening wore on, that distance would inevitably shrink. It was a slow, gravitational pull. A knee would brush against mine. An arm would rest along the back of the couch behind me. And then, the final, inevitable surrender to sleep, his body slumping against mine. I became a connoisseur of his exhaustion, of the different textures of his sleep. There was the deep, leaden sleep of pure physical fatigue, where he was a dead weight against me. There was the restless, twitchy sleep of stress, punctuated by soft murmurs and the clenching of his jaw. I learned the precise rhythm of his breathing, the way it would deepen and slow as he finally let go. And I learned to live in a state of hyper-awareness. My entire world shrank to the points of contact between our bodies. The pressure of his thigh against mine, the soft tickle of his hair against my cheek, the faint, steady thump of his heartbeat that I could sometimes feel through my own ribs. My camera work began to reflect it. I became obsessed with capturing the quiet, intimate moments between things. The way light fell on a dusty windowsill, the space between two leaves on a branch, the subtle tension in a stranger's hands as they waited for a train. I was trying to photograph the very thing I was experiencing, the profound, unbearable beauty of the unspoken. The ritual escalated on a cold, rain-lashed night in November. He'd just returned from a brutal 2-week trip to Chicago, and he looked worse than I had ever seen him. There were dark circles under his eyes that looked like bruises, and his movements were slow and heavy. We skipped the movie pretext altogether. He just sat on the couch, staring into space, while I made tea. When I handed him a mug, his fingers were trembling slightly. After a long silence, he spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "I had a nightmare on the plane," he said, not looking at me. "One of those falling dreams. Woke up just as we were landing. My heart was pounding out of my chest. I felt untethered." The word hung in the air between us. Untethered. It was the most honest thing he had said to me in months. He finished his tea in silence, then stood up and took his mug to the sink. I thought he was going to his room, but he just stood there, his back to me, gripping the edge of the counter. "Leo," he said, his voice strained. "This is going to sound weird, but could I just sleep in your room tonight? On the floor. I don't want to be alone." My heart did a painful, complicated lurch. The floor. It was another piece of plausible deniability, a carefully constructed buffer. It wasn't a request for intimacy. It was a request for proximity. A cry for help wrapped in a practical, logical package. "My room gets a weird draft," he added quickly, as if needing to reinforce the excuse. "Yours is warmer, okay?" I said, my own voice sounding strange and distant. "Yeah, of course." So I pulled the spare duvet and a pillow from the linen closet, and he made a small nest for himself on the floor next to my bed. The absurdity of it was almost comical. We were two grown men, in our own apartment, arranging a sleepover like a pair of scared children. He switched off his bedside lamp, and the room was plunged into a darkness that felt different from any other night. It was a shared darkness now, occupied by the sound of two people breathing. I lay in my bed, staring at the ceiling, my body humming with a nervous energy. I could hear every small sound he made. The rustle of the duvet, a soft sigh, the shift of his weight on the floor. It was an agony of closeness and distance. He was only a few feet away, yet he might as well have been on another continent. I felt like an astronomer observing a distant star, close enough to see its light, but knowing I could never touch it. I didn't sleep at all that night. I just listened, keeping a silent vigil over his troubled rest. The floor became a regular feature. After a particularly bad trip, he would make the same quiet request, always with a practical excuse. The draft, a strange noise in the heating pipes, the desire to be closer to the bathroom. I never questioned it. I just accepted it as the new phase of our ritual. We had moved from the public space of the living room to the private space of my bedroom, but the invisible wall between us remained. He was on the floor, and I was in the bed. The boundary was clear. Until the night it wasn't. It was almost 2 in the morning. A storm was raging outside, the kind of violent, percussive rain that makes you feel small and fragile. A clap of thunder, so loud it shook the window panes, jolted me from a light doze. In the ensuing silence, I heard him stir on the floor. A small, frightened sound, like a muffled cry. "Julian," I whispered into the darkness. There was a long pause, and then his voice, small and shaky. "It's stupid. I hate thunder." I remembered then, a conversation from years ago in our dorm room, him mentioning a childhood fear of storms, a story he'd told as a joke. But in the darkness of my room, it was no joke. He sounded genuinely terrified. Another rumble of thunder echoed in the distance, and I heard him shift again, the duvet rustling frantically. I didn't think. For the first time, I acted without the paralyzing weight of analysis. I just moved. I rolled to the edge of the bed and lifted the corner of my own duvet. It was an invitation, an unspoken offering. "There's room," I said, my voice quiet but clear in the storm-filled silence. He was silent for so long that I thought I had made a terrible mistake. I had crossed a line, misinterpreted everything, and shattered the fragile ecosystem of our unspoken arrangement. I was just about to drop the duvet and pretend it never happened when I heard him move. He rose from the floor, a shadow in the darkness, and then I felt the mattress dip beside me. He slid under the covers, his body rigid, keeping as much distance as the bed would allow. He lay on his back, staring at the ceiling, and I lay on mine, our shoulders almost, but not quite, touching. The air between us was electric, thick with a tension so profound it felt like a physical object. We lay like that for what felt like an hour, 2 statues in the dark, the storm outside a pale imitation of the one raging inside me. And then, he whispered my name. "Leo." I turned my head on the pillow to look at him. In a flash of lightning that momentarily bleached the room white, I saw his face. His eyes were wide, and he was looking at me with an expression of such raw, unguarded vulnerability that it stole my breath. It was a look I had never seen on him before. It was the look of a man stripped of all his defenses. "Don't tell anyone," he said, his voice cracking on the last word. And that was when he moved. He rolled onto his side to face me, closing the final gap between us. He brought his arm over my waist, pulling himself flush against me, burying his face in my chest. It was not a tentative gesture. It was a desperate one. It was the act of a drowning man clinging to the only solid thing in a churning sea. I felt the tremors that ran through his body, the frantic beat of his heart against my own. Hesitantly, my own body finally unfreezing, I brought my arm up and wrapped it around his shoulders, my hand coming to rest on the back of his neck. His hair was soft under my fingers. I held him, just held him, listening to the storm inside and out, until his trembling slowly subsided and his breathing deepened into the familiar rhythm of sleep. I lay awake for the rest of the night, holding him, the weight of his trust a heavy, precious thing against my heart. The line had been crossed. The boundary had dissolved, and I had no idea what it meant or what would happen when the sun came up. The crossing of that boundary, the move from the floor to the bed, should have been a cataclysm. It should have been followed by a reckoning, a conversation, a redefinition of everything. But it wasn't. The morning came, pale and gray after the storm, and when I woke up, he was gone. The space beside me was empty, the sheets cool to the touch. For a panicked moment, I thought I had dreamed it, that the storm and his fear and the solid weight of him in my arms had been a product of my own wishful imagination. But then I saw it. The duvet and pillow from the floor were still neatly folded in the corner where he had left them, an abandoned artifact from a previous era. He had been there. It had been real. He was already in the kitchen when I emerged, dressed for work, pouring coffee into a travel mug. He moved with a brisk, almost frantic energy, a stark contrast to the shattered vulnerability of the night before. He didn't look at me. He just offered a clipped, Morning. Coffee's fresh, before focusing intently on screwing the lid onto his mug. The air was thick with a new kind of silence, not the comfortable quiet we were used to, but a brittle, awkward silence, shimmering with unspoken words. The secret we now shared was a living thing in the room, a third presence at our small kitchen table. I just nodded, pouring myself a cup, my hands feeling clumsy and oversized. I wanted to say something, to ask if he was okay, to acknowledge what had happened, but the words wouldn't form. His defenses were back up, the walls of his easygoing, professional persona rebuilt stronger than ever. To speak of the night would be to tear them down again, and I sensed, with a sinking feeling, that he wasn't ready for that. So we let it lie. We fell into a new, stranger ritual. The ritual of avoidance. He started coming home later, or going out with colleagues after work, something he rarely did before. Our movie nights ceased to exist. When we were in the apartment at the same time, we orbited each other cautiously, our conversations limited to safe, logistical topics. Did the landlord fix the leaky faucet? Whose turn was it to buy milk? It was a painstaking, exhausting dance of pretending that nothing had changed, when in fact, everything had. The ambiguity that had once been a source of torturous hope was now just a source of pain. The bed, my bed, felt enormous and empty. But the nights he was home, the nights he was worn down by a long flight or a difficult client, the pull was too strong to resist. The ritual would resume, but now it was freighted with a new, unspoken significance. There was no more pretense of the floor. Around midnight, or 1, or 2, my door would click open. He would slide into bed without a word, and I would turn to him, and we would hold each other in the darkness. We never spoke of it. We were like two nocturnal creatures, living a secret life that only existed between the hours of midnight and dawn. In the dark, we were not friends or roommates. We were just two bodies seeking warmth, two hearts beating in the same quiet rhythm. He would sleep, a deep and dreamless sleep he seemed only able to find in my arms. I would lie awake, my mind racing, trying to decipher the unreadable text of our relationship. This duality was tearing me apart. In the daylight, he was a stranger, a polite roommate I barely knew. In the darkness, he was the most intimate part of my life. I was living for the night, for the moments when his guard was down, and he would allow himself this silent, desperate form of connection. I felt like a photographer working in a darkroom, spending all my time in a world of shadows and faint light, developing an image that I was terrified to bring out into the sun, for fear that the harsh light of day would reveal it to be nothing at all. The longing inside me grew into a constant, physical ache. It was no longer enough to be his secret harbor. I wanted to be his home, in the light as well as in the dark. I wanted to know what this meant. I wanted to know if the comfort he sought was specific to me, or if any warm body would have sufficed. The breaking point came on a Saturday. He had been home for a full week, a rare occurrence, and the tension in the apartment had been stretched to a nearly unbearable tautness. We had barely spoken 2 words to each other. That night, as expected, he came to my room. He slid into bed, and I turned to him, my body moving with a familiar, practiced motion. He curled against me, his head finding its usual place on my chest, his arm wrapping around my waist. But tonight, something felt different. There was a restlessness in him, a tension in his muscles that sleep didn't seem to be soothing. I lay there for what felt like hours, my own anxiety mirroring his. The silence was no longer a comfort, it was a weight. I couldn't bear it anymore. The need to know, one way or the other, was greater than my fear of the answer. I had to risk it. I had to risk everything. "Julian," I whispered, my voice a dry rasp in the quiet room. He stiffened in my arms. A long moment passed. I thought he would pretend to be asleep. But then, he answered, his voice muffled against my t-shirt. "Yeah." My heart was hammering against my ribs, so hard I was sure he could feel it. I chose my words carefully, trying to keep my voice steady. "What are we doing?" The question hung in the air, simple and direct, and utterly terrifying. He didn't answer. He just lay there, perfectly still. I could feel the frantic working of his mind, the whirring of the gears as he searched for an escape route, for a piece of plausible deniability to cling to. I need you to be honest with me. I pressed on, my voice gaining a fragile strength. Is this just about not wanting to be alone? Am I just a convenient presence, a warm body in the dark? The words tasted like acid, the articulation of my deepest fear. He pulled away then, rolling onto his back to stare at the ceiling. The loss of his warmth was immediate and sharp, a physical pain. He ran a hand over his face, a gesture of profound weariness. I don't know, Leo, he said, his voice strained and quiet. I honestly don't know. I'm so tired. And when I'm here, with you, I can finally shut my brain off. I can sleep. It's the only place I feel safe. The word was both a comfort and a knife. He felt safe with me. But was that all it was? Was I his human security blanket? But what does it mean? I asked, pushing myself up on one elbow to look at him, to try and read his expression in the faint moonlight filtering through the window. What does it mean to you? He turned his head to look at me, and his eyes were filled with a desperate, heartbreaking confusion. It means I'm losing my mind, he whispered. It means I spend all week in a hotel room in some city I don't care about, just counting the hours until I can get back here. It means this. He gestured to the space between us, to the bed, to the room, is the only thing that feels real anymore. And it scares the hell out of me. We were no longer in the realm of friendship. We were in uncharted territory, and he was just as lost as I was. A surge of something, bravery, or maybe just desperation, rose up in me. I reached out, my hand hesitating for a fraction of a second before I rested it on his cheek. His skin was warm. He didn't pull away. He closed his eyes, leaning into my touch with a soft, involuntary sigh. Look at me, I said softly. He opened his eyes. They were shining with unshed tears. The world seemed to slow down. The sounds of the city outside faded away. There was only the space between us, the feel of his skin under my palm, the sight of his vulnerability laid bare. The question that had been living inside me for years finally rose to the surface, demanding to be spoken. But it wasn't a question anymore. It was a choice. My choice. I leaned in, slowly, giving him every opportunity to turn away, to stop me, to break the spell. But he didn't move. He just watched me, his breath hitched in his throat. And then, our lips met. It wasn't a passionate kiss, or a demanding one. It was tentative. It was a question, a confession, and an answer all at once. It was soft and achingly gentle. It was the taste of salt and uncertainty and a deep, profound relief. It was the feeling of a photograph, held in darkness for years, finally being exposed to the light. It lasted only a few seconds, but it reshaped my entire world. I pulled back, just enough to see his face. His eyes were still closed, and a single tear had escaped, tracing a shimmering path down his temple. Leo, he breathed, his voice thick with emotion. It was the only word he said, but in the way he said my name, in the fragile, wondering tone of it, I heard everything. I heard the crumbling of his walls, the surrender to a feeling he had been fighting for so long. The crossing had been made. There was no going back. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid of what the morning would bring. The aftermath was not the explosion I had feared, nor was it the quiet dawn of understanding I had hoped for. It was a retreat, a full-scale, panicked withdrawal. When I woke the next morning, the space beside me was not just empty. It felt like a void. Julian was gone, not just from the bed, but from the apartment. A hastily scrawled note was left on the kitchen counter. Got called into an early meeting. Project in Denver. Be back in a few days. No mention of the night before. No acknowledgement of the kiss that had felt, to me, like a tectonic shift in the foundation of our world. It was a dismissal, a clean, corporate severing of the moment. The days that followed were some of the longest of my life. The apartment was suffocatingly silent. Every creak of the floorboards, every hum of the refrigerator seemed to amplify his absence. I tried to work, to lose myself in the familiar comfort of my darkroom, but the images I developed seemed to mock me. They were all about intimacy, about the spaces between people, and all they did was remind me of the new, gaping chasm between Julian and me. I replayed the kiss over and over in my mind, analyzing it from every angle like a flawed photograph. Had I imagined the vulnerability in his eyes? Had I misinterpreted his tears? Had I, in my own desperate longing, forced a meaning onto a moment of simple, confused exhaustion? The fear that I had been nothing more than a port in a storm, a convenient comfort he now regretted, began to take root and grow, a cold, thorny vine twisting around my heart. He was gone for 5 days. 5 days of unanswered texts and calls sent straight to voicemail. On the 6th day, he came back. I heard his key in the lock late in the evening, and my entire body tensed. He walked in, looking even more haggard than usual, and dropped his bags by the door without a word. He wouldn't look at me. He just moved past me toward his room, a stranger in our shared home. The smell of stale airplane air and corporate coffee followed him like a shroud. I couldn't let it go. Not this time. The ambiguity was no longer something I could live with. The silence was no longer a space of potential. It was a weapon he was using to erase what had happened. "Julian," I said, my voice sharp enough to make him stop in his doorway, his back still to me. He stood there for a long moment, his shoulders slumped. "I'm tired, Leo," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "I just want to sleep in your own bed, I assume." The words were out before I could stop them, laced with a bitterness that surprised even me. He finally turned around, and the look on his face was not one of anger, but of a deep, painful exhaustion. He looked cornered, trapped. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice cracking. "I want the truth," I said, stepping closer, my own fear making me bold. "I want you to stop hiding. I want you to talk to me. What was that kiss? What are all those nights in my bed? What am I to you, Julian? Because I can't live in the dark anymore. I can't be your midnight secret and your daylight stranger. It's killing me." The confession hung in the air, raw and exposed. His carefully constructed composure finally crumbled. He leaned his forehead against the doorframe, his eyes squeezed shut. "You think this is easy for me?" he whispered, his voice ragged. "I don't know who I am anymore. My whole life, I've had a plan, a blueprint. College, job, girlfriend, future. It was all laid out, a straight line. And you're not on the blueprint, Leo. None of this is." He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a frantic, desperate confusion. I've never felt this way about a guy, about anyone. This feeling, it doesn't fit into any of the boxes in my life. And I don't know what to do with it. Every time I'm near you, I feel like I'm losing my footing, like the whole world is tilting on its axis. And it scares me. So I run. I go to Denver. I bury myself in work. I try to pretend it didn't happen. I try to put things back in their neat, orderly boxes. But it doesn't work. Because all I can think about is coming back here. His confession was a torrent, a messy, chaotic flood of fear and feeling that washed away all of my own anger, leaving only a profound, aching empathy. He wasn't rejecting me. He was terrified of himself. He was the unknowing initiator who had finally been forced to know, and the knowledge was breaking him. I closed the remaining distance between us, stopping just in front of him. I didn't touch him. I just stood there, letting him see that I wasn't going to run, that his confusion didn't scare me. "So don't run," I said, my voice soft now. "Stay? Be scared here. With me. We can be scared together." His breath hitched, and a shudder ran through his body. He looked at me, really looked at me, as if seeing me for the first time without the filter of his own fear. He saw not just his roommate, not just his convenient comfort, but a person who was offering him a safe place to fall apart. "I don't want to hurt you," he whispered, a final, desperate plea. "You already are," I replied, the truth of it simple and clean. "By pretending, by running. The only way you can stop hurting me is to stop running away from this." From me, slowly, as if moving through deep water, he reached out and tangled his fingers in the front of my shirt, holding on like I was the only thing keeping him upright. He rested his forehead against mine, our breaths mingling in the small space between us. "Okay," he breathed. The word was a surrender, a promise. "Okay, I'm done running." The resolution did not arrive like a sudden sunrise, chasing away all the shadows at once. It was more like a slow, northern dawn, a gradual lightening of the sky that took its time, that allowed our eyes to adjust. The conversation in the hallway was not an end, but a beginning. It was the moment we agreed to learn a new language together, a language that had, until then, been composed entirely of silence and gesture. Now, we had to find the words. It was awkward at first. We were like two people trying to navigate a familiar room after all the furniture had been rearranged in the dark. We stumbled. We bumped into things. There were long, hesitant pauses in our conversations, moments where one of us would start to say something, only to trail off, unsure of the new rules. The first few days were a study in cautious proximity. He slept in his own room, the door pointedly left ajar. It was a gesture I understood. He was trying to respect the new boundary we had drawn, while simultaneously showing me he wasn't shutting me out. We started talking, really talking, not about logistics or work, but about the vast, unspoken territory that had existed between us for years. He told me about the crushing pressure he felt to live up to an idea of himself he wasn't even sure he believed in anymore. The successful consultant, the confident guy, the straight man. He confessed that the comfort he found in my arms wasn't just about loneliness. It was about the relief of being able to drop the performance, of being with someone who demanded nothing from him but his simple presence. He admitted, in a voice barely above a whisper, that the kiss had felt less like a transgression and more like a homecoming, and that was what had terrified him the most. In return, I found my own voice. I told him about that rainy Tuesday in our sophomore year, about the moment I knew my feelings for him had changed. I confessed the years of quiet, hopeless longing, the pain of watching him with his girlfriends, the fear of losing the most important friendship I had ever had. I explained how every touch, every night on the couch, every moment in my bed had been both a gift and a form of exquisite torture. Laying my own vulnerability bare was terrifying, but it was also liberating. It was like finally showing him the fully developed photograph, with all its light and shadow, and letting him see the truth of it. The turning point came about a week later. We were on the couch, watching a movie, a deliberate and self-conscious recreation of our old ritual. But this time, there was a careful foot of space between us. The air was still thick with a certain hesitation. Halfway through the film, he muted the volume and turned to me. "Can I ask you something?" he said, his expression serious. I nodded. "This whole time, when I was coming to your room, why did you let me? Why didn't you ever say anything?" I thought for a moment, wanting to give him the truest answer I could. "Because," I said slowly, "I think on some level, I understood that you were asking for help in the only way you knew how. You couldn't use words, so you used proximity. And I guess, I was just so grateful to be the person you came to, that I was willing to live with the ambiguity. It was better than nothing." And then I added, my voice softer. "And because I hoped it meant what I wanted it to mean." He looked at me, and something in his eyes seemed to settle, to find its focus. He closed the distance between us on the couch, not with the tired slump of his old self, but with a clear, deliberate intention. He took my hand, his fingers lacing through mine. The simple, open gesture in the full light of the living room was more intimate than anything we had ever done in the dark. "It did," he said, his voice quiet but certain. "It always did. I was just too scared to see it, that night." He didn't wait until the dead of night. After we turned off the TV, he just stood up, still holding my hand, and looked toward my bedroom. "Is it okay?" he asked. The question was different now. It wasn't a plea for secret comfort. It was a request for open intimacy. A question between two people who were finally on the same page. "Yes," I said. "It's okay." And we walked to my room together. He closed the door behind us, not to hide a secret, but to create a private world, our world. There was no pretense, no plausible deniability. There was just us. We lay down facing each other, the kiss we shared slow and sure, a conversation instead of a question. And when we settled in to sleep, his arms around me, his body flush against mine, his breathing deep and even, it felt different. It was not the desperate clinging of a man adrift, but the peaceful, solid presence of a man who was finally home. Our new normal was quiet, and it was beautiful. It was built of small, ordinary moments that were now imbued with a new significance. It was him making me coffee in the morning, his hand lingering on my lower back as he passed behind me. It was me editing photos at my desk, feeling his chin come to rest on my shoulder as he watched, his quiet presence a comfort rather than a distraction. It was falling asleep holding hands, and waking up in the same position. The grand, terrifying chasm of unspoken feelings had been replaced by 1,000 tiny, sturdy bridges of affection, built word by word, touch by touch. He didn't stop being the vibrant, brilliant man who saw the world in systems, and I didn't stop being the quiet observer who saw it in light and shadow. We just learned how to share our ways of seeing, how to build a world that had room for both. One afternoon, a few months later, I was in my darkroom, the red light casting its otherworldly glow over everything. I was developing a new series of portraits, photos I had taken of Julian around the apartment. Not posed, but candid shots. Julian, asleep on the couch, the morning light catching the line of his jaw. Julian, laughing at something on his laptop, the dimple beside his mouth in sharp focus. Julian, standing by the window, looking out at the rain, a thoughtful, peaceful expression on his face. As I watched his image emerge in the chemical bath, clear and true, I thought about how our story was like this process. It had started as a latent image, full of shadows and potential, hidden in the dark. It had been frightening to expose it to the light, to risk ruining it completely. But by taking that risk, by allowing the truth to develop, we had created something real, something permanent, something beautiful. We began to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we'd learned to create together, a silence that was no longer about what was unsaid, but about what no longer needed to be said at all.